American Secession, The Looming Threat of a National Breakup by F.H. Buckley. Chapter 1, One Nation Divisible. This chapter introduced a man by the name of Don Livingston, who was a person who started an organization in 2003 called the Abbeville Institute, which was actually the birthplace of John Calhoun, who was a senator from South Carolina during the American Civil War, or the war between the states. There are a number of different terms to describe that conflict, depending on who we speak to. Some have called it a civil war, but I think one of the most important observations of that particular conflict was that it was a war of secession. Now, this is not mentioned in Chapter 1, but it does give us a glimpse of how the American Civil War has been described through the annals of history. It is said that history is sort of determined by the victor, and that is most definitely the case. And that's really a large theme in this particular chapter. War, particularly the American Civil War, through the prism of slavery. That's one of the challenges that we have as Americans to, when we think about the idea of secession, we're always sort of thinking about it through that prism, and that's a bit unfortunate. One thing that is very important, the author notes, is that Southern culture is in fact different. There's more so in the past than today with media and things of that nature, but there was a unique culture that exists in the South in terms of manners and customs and understandings of gentility and things of that nature. At least that's the point that he made. Southerners are the only Americans that have actually experienced the loss of a war. But a war on American soil was lost by Americans, and that was an issue that was lost as a result of, as most Americans would say, slavery. And afterward, Southern culture during the period of Reconstruction up through the Civil Rights era was sort of known for very, very poor treatment of the black population. There were mass lynchings, there were white citizen councils, and so the South has both lost a war and has maintained a system of racial oppression for a very, very long period of time, until that actually ended relatively recently. Of the fact that the South has changed over the years, that there is in fact a new South, that there are liberal cities, little liberal enclaves, Austin, Texas being one of which, any place where there's a large school as an example. There is an understanding that the South has fundamentally changed even by diehard Southerners. And instead of saying, yeah, we live in a new South, that there is no South, N-O, South. Southern culture has migrated outside of the South. Things like NASCAR became more popular. Southern music, country western music has also come to be known outside of the South in northern enclaves. So that was a little bit of a discussion about that. Was a analysis of these sort of very distinct periods of time. So, for example, from the founding to the Civil War, there was a very uneasy but accepted relationship with slavery. Slaves were slaves, even freed slaves were not citizens, and that's just the way it's going to be. Southern slave owners, like Thomas Jefferson, recognized that slavery was an issue that was going to have to be dealt with at some point in the course of the country's development. I think it was said, this was not mentioned in the book, but Thomas Jefferson, in writing the Declaration of Independence, even thought or penned at one point that slavery was like a wolf that you held by the ears. You were terrified to hold it, but you didn't want to let go. Pretty sure that was Jefferson. In any case, we went through a different period of time from the founding to the Civil War where there was slavery and that was just the way it was. After the Civil War, or up like sort of the Civil War and Reconstruction, we had an understanding that there was no longer going to be slavery, but there was going to be suppression of black people. There was going to be Jim Crow, segregation, lynchings, even up to and including the presidency of Woodrow Wilson in 1913. There was a resegregation process. And of course, the Ku Klux Klan was really at the height of its population in the 1920s. There was a very interesting relationship with the South in terms of becoming reconciled. So generals like General Lee were viewed as noble, giving the good fight, proud, but maybe a little misguided. That period, those sort of revisionist history type of ideas really gained a lot of popularity in the 1920s when a number of the monuments, that Civil War monuments, that are dotting the countryside, up to and including in northern states, interestingly, were a way of reaffirming the nobility of the lost cause. And it was in the civil rights movement, probably around the real marker of that is about 1969, where the goodwill towards the South really started to change. There was a grand compromise which basically had stated that discrimination could be banned, but Southern pride should be celebrated. Goodwill that was created during the civil rights movement and the understanding that people should be free start to end. There's no goodwill. The whole thing, the whole enterprise was racist. Statues need to come down, and that's what we're seeing right now. And that actually leads to a pretty major point in this chapter, which is where he notes that millions of people in one section of the country are told that they're evil. There is no compromise. The war was racist. It cannot be accepted in any way, shape, or form. The Confederate battle flag cannot be tolerated in any state flag. It all needs to come down. So when millions of people are in one section of the country are told they don't belong, and that cannot be rebutted, there's no excuse for it, he says, the natural conclusion is, well, where do we belong? What we see is a very interesting lens in which people with this sort of new idea come down and look at people who live in the South with a very unique culture, as was mentioned before, and just don't understand it. It's like going to a different planet. The author mentioned a New Yorker article in 2018 by Dan Pippenberg, where he went to a Chick-fil-A, the headquarters in Atlanta, and was disgusted by the commercial evangelical messaging that a company could talk about God openly was seen as reprehensible. How does that work? News reporters basically no longer hide their bias. And that attack on people, we hear that in things like the deplorables with Hillary Clinton, or even just an attack on a president like President Trump, regardless of how you feel about him, enough people voted him in because they perhaps felt that he was one of them, that the news media went to attack the legitimacy of his presidency and every single person that he appointed. Conservative equals racist. What I don't believe in, what I disagree with, is seen as racist. So it's very hard to have a discussion when people are coming to these conclusions, when social media is causing polarization. And people don't have a place to go. So one of the things that Buckley had mentioned in this first chapter was that there was a Rasmussen poll in June of 2018 where 31% of the population admitted to thinking that civil war was going to happen in the next 5 years. Culture. What links us together? There's no ethnic or even social cohesion. There was an understanding that even though you and I may disagree on a idea, that the Constitution, the system itself had value, and that should be preserved. But now the value of the Constitution itself is being challenged. Classic liberal principles, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all of those Enlightenment ideas of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, in many ways being tossed to the side. There are many in the country that have an idea of creedal, as in a creed, nationalism. Veterans will often say this. I, as a veteran, have often said this, that the one thing that unites us is the Constitution, that we swore an oath to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. A creedal nationalism. It's the one thing that unites us. It's one of the reasons why people who see others burning the flag get so upset, because we're a huge country, and up until very, very recently, that's one thing that very much unites us. It's one of the reasons why people get upset when people don't stand for the national anthem. It's an affront because we all have signed up for an idea. The author made a point of saying that the periods of time, remember the founding to the Civil War being the 1, the Civil War being to the civil rights being 2, being 3, sort of the good feeling period, ended in the year 2010, the present period, when we have political parties ramming through legislation with no sensitivity to the opposition having a voice. The Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, was seen as a major example of that, where not one Republican amendment was listened to or added, and President Obama said there are consequences to elections. He won. While it has benefited certain points of society, it has been very, very expensive and affected others in negative ways. So the understanding of compromise has been in many ways destroyed. There's no common ground. So I'll leave it there for today. I hope that you will leave your comments below. Please like the channel if you haven't done so already, and share this with other people who might be interested in joining the conversation. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I look forward to the next time when we go on to Chapter 2.